Emma's voice rose above the chaotic energy of the crowd. "Why did you hit that man?" she demanded, her wide eyes scanning the sea of onlookers pressing in around us. I met her gaze steadily. "Because he told me he was sleeping with you," I said, my voice firm yet quiet. "And I didn't think he deserved to walk away after that." Her breath caught, her body stiff as though she had been struck. "But he never even spoke to you." I exhaled, already bracing for the frustrating back and forth this conversation was bound to become. Instead of answering right away, I grabbed her arm and pulled her out of the throng, guiding her toward the hotel balcony. The city stretched out before us in shimmering waves of neon and glass, but I barely noticed. My focus was on her. She spun on her heel, crossing her arms. "Larry, what is happening? You just got up and knocked Justin to the ground for no reason." I clenched my jaw, frustration simmering beneath the surface. "It wasn't for no reason, Emma. I don't throw punches without thinking. I told you, I hit him because he's been with you. My wife." The words felt heavy in my mouth. Her breath hitched, and she turned away, hands shaking as she searched for anything to anchor herself. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "How can you even say that? How dare you? I have never." I cut her off. "Yes, you have. And pretending otherwise isn't going to make this any easier. So let's stop playing games and deal with this mess you created." Her lip trembled as she whispered, "Why would you think that? I've always been honest with you." A sharp burst of frustration escaped me. "Enough, Emma. I've known for weeks. I just didn't know who it was until tonight." Her brows furrowed. "But he never said a word to you." I shook my head. "He didn't have to. It was obvious." She stood frozen, completely lost in the storm of accusations. I glanced over my shoulder. There was no escaping this now. Emergency services were bound to arrive soon. Police, medics, maybe even the fire department if someone had gone overboard with their emergency call. For all I knew, the military might show up at this rate. Might as well settle this before they did. "Stay here," I told her, my tone firm enough to leave no room for argument. Then I stepped back inside. At our table, I grabbed 2 drinks and reached for the cigar case I always carried, the one with the built-in cutter and lighter. Emma had given it to me last year for my birthday, right after she had been promoted. I used to treasure it almost as much as what it held inside. Back when things were different. Back when I still loved her the way I once did. Not long after her promotion, I had bought her a sapphire and emerald pendant. That was how we were careful, deliberate in the gifts we chose for one another. We had taken the time to make sure everything was meaningful, perfect. When I returned, she had collapsed into one of the cold metal chairs lining the balcony, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and despair. Inside, the event continued at full volume. The company had booked the entire conference hall for their awards ceremony, but out here, it was just us. She parted her lips to speak. "Larry, I held up a hand to stop her. "Wait." I took out my cigar, clipped the end, and lit it. Inhaling deeply, I let the burn settle before exhaling into the night air. Only then did I turn back to her. "You've been cheating on me," I said, my voice even. "For 4 weeks. Maybe longer." She recoiled as if I had slapped her. "That's not true." "You thought you were being careful," I continued, "but you weren't." Smoke curled around me as I watched her, her face pale under the city lights. "It was your stories that gave you away." Her head jerked up. "What stories? What are you talking about?" A bitter chuckle slipped out before I could stop it. "The ones you and your friends tell when we all get together." For 6 years, we had built a life that looked solid from the outside. We had our daughter, Brenda. We had our circle of friends, people just like us, professionals who worked hard and played harder. Every weekend, we either hosted or attended gatherings. Backyard barbecues, lake trips, Sunday afternoons at the park, it was all routine. And in those gatherings, as if by an unspoken rule, the men naturally gravitated toward one another, forming their own group, while the women did the same. In our circle, the men swapped updates about work, retold things our wives had said, talked about upcoming vacations. We laughed about our kids, exchanged advice, threw in some talk about business, politics, and, of course, sports. It had always been that way. Until it wasn't. We were always trying to outdo each other, each story becoming more exaggerated and hilarious than the last. And the women? They had their own version of this game, except their conversations followed a different rhythm. I had spent enough time within earshot of their gatherings to recognize the familiar themes: husbands, children, home life, shopping. Funny enough, the men discussed many of the same things, just from another angle. But the way the women spoke, the tone they used, And the underlying messages, they all had a distinct quality. At first, it was subtle, something I barely noticed. But once I started paying attention, I couldn't stop. Over time, I realized their conversations had a pattern. What began as casual chatter inevitably shifted toward analyzing their husbands' actions. Eventually, the focus would narrow to everything their husbands did wrong. If there was one subject they enjoyed discussing more than their kids' tantrums, messy bedrooms, and picky eating habits, it was their husbands, and just how incapable they were. It always started small, a light-hearted retelling of something a husband had done, delivered with just the right emphasis to earn a laugh. But soon enough, the stories escalated, as if each woman was competing to share the most absurd failure, the most ridiculous mistake. The laughter grew louder, sharper, edged with something not entirely good-natured. One sarcastic remark led to another, a cutting joke here, a mocking jab there, until the group dynamic demanded that each news story be even more humiliating than the last. If it weren't for the kids, these conversations might have spiraled endlessly. But more often than not, a child would break the flow, crying over a scraped knee, squabbling with a sibling, or simply demanding attention. And honestly, I never minded the interruptions. Kids were just being kids, after all. Looking back, I understand now that venting like this wasn't unusual when women gathered. Even I could admit that some men were truly thoughtless partners, undeserving of the women in their lives. Maybe these conversations were just a way for the wives to let off steam, frustration softened under the guise of humor. But the first time I truly listened, really heard what was being said, it caught me off guard. I was in the kitchen, tending to the marinade for the steaks and chops, when a sudden burst of laughter erupted from the living room. The sound made me smile. Without thinking, I tuned in. May was in the middle of a story, shaking her head as she described Dom's nightly routine. Every night, he tries to land his socks in the laundry basket from across the room, like he's some kind of basketball star. Trick shots, spins, he acts like there's a whole crowd watching him. Nicole groaned. At least he makes the effort. Logan just drops his on the floor the second they come off, like they disappear the moment they leave his feet. Oh, they're real enough when I have to pick them up, she added dryly. Gabriel chimed in. That's nothing. Vern has this talent for turning his boxers inside out when he takes them off. Every single time. And guess who has to flip them back the right way to wash them? I don't even want to touch them, let alone look at them. I pressed my lips together to keep from laughing. Vern, the guy who always acted so tough, was getting torn apart over his laundry habits. But the jokes kept coming. Janice spoke up next. If Pete notices, well, let's just say, if there are, marks, he balls them up and hides them inside his socks. So guess what I have to do? Unroll that mess just to wash them. Reggie snickered. The ones with the minions on them, right? Janice barely contained her laughter. Nope, he's upgraded. Now they have the Avengers. Iron Man, to be exact. Gabriel smirked. More like a male version of Elastigirl, she quipped, her tone completely deadpan. The room exploded with laughter, the deep, uncontrollable kind that left people gasping for air. Pete had just been sacrificed for the amusement of the group, and it only went downhill from there. From Pete's lackluster skills in the bedroom, to Stan's cringe-worthy attempts at flirting, to Dom's so-called beer belly, which, according to them, needed either a corset or a complete intervention, no husband was spared. And the thing was, I never even thought Dom was overweight. The whole thing took me by surprise. These were women who, from the outside, seemed happy in their marriages. And yet here they were, locked in an unspoken contest to see whose husband was the most incompetent. Sure, they were all laughing, but something about it felt off. At best, it was disrespectful. At worst, downright cruel. How could they go home to these men after saying things like this? Even if it was just for fun, even if they didn't mean it, something about it didn't sit right. For a long time, I felt lucky. Emma never really got involved in these conversations. She'd walk by, maybe toss in a comment here or there, but she never fully joined in. Until 3 weeks ago. We were at Harold and Ingrid's house, and as I walked past the living room window, I caught a glimpse of Emma, wineglass in hand, laughing harder than I had ever seen before. I stopped, confused. Curious. Stepping inside the house, I hesitated just out of sight, listening. The usual chorus of complaints filled the air, husbands and their bizarre habits, their peculiar quirks, their outright repulsive behaviors. Each woman took her turn, determined to top the last. Then I heard her voice. Oh, believe me, I completely understand, Emma groaned. The sounds Larry makes when he flosses his teeth. Laughter erupted before she even finished, but she continued undeterred. It's like some awful mix of gagging, sneezing, humming the Frozen theme song, and gargling simultaneously. My face burned with embarrassment. Before I could fully absorb it, Gabriel chimed in, giggling. I think that's the noise Vern made last night when we were together. Someone quipped, a true romantic. Emma smirked. Not even close. My husband is way more romantic than that. For a split second, I thought she might actually defend me. But then she added with a grin, when Larry finishes, it sounds like a vet just shoved his entire arm inside a cow without warning. Nicole chuckled. No sweet talk, no dinner, straight to it. Not even a single flower, Emma added, sealing the joke. The whole group roared with laughter, entertained at my expense. I had heard enough. If anyone knew how I sounded in that moment, it was me. And what she described, it was complete nonsense. I didn't grunt, bray, or make some absurd animalistic noise. When it happened, I exhaled in slow, deep sighs, more like a reaction to expected pain than anything else. Like when a doctor presses on a sprained knee, and you brace yourself, knowing what's coming. I didn't want to cause a scene in front of everyone, so I played along, kept my composure. But inside, it unsettled me. The rest of the day unfolded as it usually did. Wine, sunshine, casual conversation. That night, after tucking our 3-year-old daughter, Brenda, into bed, I went straight to sleep. But that imitation of me, the one Emma had so vividly performed, kept replaying in my head. And I knew it wouldn't stop until I figured out why. By Monday morning, I needed answers. I called up Henning Merritz from HR and invited him to lunch on my company expense account. Henning, originally from Germany, fit every cliché about Germans and humor, or rather, the lack of it. But what he did possess was intelligence, sharp as a razor, and a background in psychology before transitioning into personnel management. That made him the perfect person to consult. As I explained what had happened, he nodded, taking a slow sip of his water before speaking. Oh, I see. You seek wisdom from a German about an emotional wound because, as you know, we are such deeply emotional people. I just stared. After a beat, he sighed. That was a joke. Oh, sorry. I'm just not in the mood. Understandable. He shrugged. So, what do you need from me? I want to understand why. Why would my wife do that? Why would she make something up just to embarrass me? Henning pursed his lips, glancing at the menu while considering his response. You're aware of my theory on sexual economics? I nodded. He had gone on about it at length during an excruciatingly dull work conference. Then you'll understand that, in my perspective, she's doing this for one of 3 possible reasons. He held up a finger. Which one? That, I can't say for sure without speaking to her directly, something I assume you don't want me to do. I shook my head. The last thing I needed was for Emma to feel like I was launching some kind of interrogation. If she caught wind of this, I could expect weeks, maybe even months, of cold silence and barely concealed resentment. Henning continued, lifting a finger. First possibility, she feels disconnected from the other women. Perhaps she believes that mocking you strengthens her bond with them. I nodded. That had crossed my mind. But we had been part of this group for years. Why would she suddenly feel the need to do that now? Henning raised a second finger. Second possibility, you have hurt her in some way, whether intentionally or not. And this is her passive-aggressive way of getting back at you. I exhaled. That one stung. Because, honestly, what husband ever truly knows what he's done to upset his wife until she finally spells it out, sometimes years later? I mentally scrolled through our recent interactions. Had I missed an anniversary? Said something inconsiderate? Or, worse, overlooked an event she had subtly hinted at? Something like we should go to lunch sometime, which I had failed to register as an actual plan. Henning raised a third finger. Third possibility, she's lowering your status in the group to raise her own. By portraying you as the fool, she gains sympathy and solidarity from the others. I frowned. You think she's trying to turn them against me? He shrugged. It wouldn't be the first time something like this happened. You see it everywhere, within families, between siblings, even among colleagues. As we ate, Henning continued his lecture, delving into the concept of sexual economic theory, the idea that individuals advance themselves by leveraging others to gain resources, social status, or even genetic material. This, of course, was precisely why I rarely had lunch with him. Yet, despite his long-winded explanations, his words lingered in my mind. Later that week, I casually inquired about the next social gathering. Emma informed me that Nicole and Logan would be hosting. I nodded, acknowledging the information. That should be nice, I remarked. She glanced at me with a smile. You seem to really enjoy spending time with the girls lately. Her expression softened. I do. They're a great group. I observed her closely. You seem closer to them than before. She shrugged. Yeah. I don't know why it took me so long to feel at ease with them. That made me think. Could it be that she had grown comfortable with them because they were decent people? Or was it the opposite, because they lacked integrity, loyalty, and genuine regard for anyone, including their own husbands? This realization prompted me to start paying closer attention to their conversations. And soon enough, the truth became evident. The moment one of them was absent, the others would tear into her, as if she were a wounded fish surrounded by ravenous sharks. Henning had an explanation for that as well. He once told me that women gossip more than men because, unlike men, they rarely resort to physical confrontation. Instead, their primary tool is social maneuvering. He went on to elaborate, men are natural hunters, while women are gatherers. Although gathering provides sustenance, it lacks the richness of what hunting offers. As a result, women are instinctively driven to seek resources that, traditionally, men are more adept at providing. In exchange, women offer exclusivity and intimacy, something that doesn't hold the same value when men provide it. To attract male attention, women enhance their appearance, makeup, stylish clothing, constant competition. But when that isn't enough, another method emerges: gossip. It becomes a strategy, a way to subtly undermine a rival's desirability, faithfulness, or worth in the eyes of a man, all while elevating one's own status. Henning had gone on and on about it, but his point stuck with me. Gossip wasn't just idle chatter, it was a calculated move. And if I wasn't careful, Emma might be using it against me. Why don't they just call each other out? I had asked. If they all know it's happening, why not just say it outright? Henning had taken a sip of his wine, his gaze thoughtful. Because that would defeat the purpose. He placed his glass down before continuing. First, it would lessen the impact of the insult. Undermining someone's reputation is a powerful tool, but only when wielded strategically. Second, directly admitting to witnessing such behavior would associate the woman with the very act she's condemning. If she acknowledges it firsthand, it implies she has been in similar situations herself, which could weaken her perceived exclusivity. And in the realm of social dynamics, that's a major disadvantage. He had pointed at me. It's a big problem when it comes to maintaining value. I had taken a moment to let that sink in. So, gossiping is the solution? Henning had nodded. It's how our minds are wired. That's messed up, I had muttered. He had simply shrugged. It's just human nature. I had leaned forward, still trying to make sense of it. But if they all know they talk behind each other's backs, why not just acknowledge it? Henning had smirked. Ah, now that's the fascinating part. Studies show that most women believe their friends would defend them in these situations. Almost every woman interviewed claimed she didn't gossip and insisted she would never tolerate it about her friends. I had frowned. That doesn't add up. Exactly, he had said. Because if that were true, gossip wouldn't exist at all. He had chuckled. So I wouldn't take those denials too seriously. I had leaned back, trying to digest everything. But Henning, always the theorist, had continued. From an economic perspective, it's also about maintaining the value of exclusivity. If a woman is perceived as unfaithful, it increases the supply of intimacy in the market, much like any other commodity. And when supply goes up, value drops. If all women disregarded exclusivity, the effort required for a man to access intimacy would be almost nothing. I had rubbed my temples, exhaling. So, by allowing others to be seen as unfaithful, women ensure that their own perceived exclusivity retains its worth. Henning had raised his glass. Precisely. Those who manage to appear virtuous while still being desirable to one man maintain their status. It's all about positioning. I had muttered something under my breath and taken a long sip of my own drink, already regretting the conversation. The whole theory left a bitter taste in my mouth. Because if Henning was right, if women truly viewed men as nothing more than providers in exchange for exclusivity and intimacy, what did that say about my marriage? Emma had made a clear promise to be faithful when we married. And, by implication, she had also promised to share intimacy with me. But was I actually getting either? One thing was certain. I wasn't receiving nearly as much intimacy as had been promised. Once a week, if that. More realistically, once a month. And if that nagging voice in my head was right, I wasn't getting exclusivity either. Someone else was. I watched. I didn't lose control, didn't lash out with baseless accusations. Without solid proof, confronting her could turn an unspoken doubt into a real problem. Emma wasn't the type to retreat from a fight. If I accused her outright, with nothing but suspicion, she might have acted out of sheer defiance. So, I waited. For nearly a month, I kept my eyes open. No clear signs, nothing obvious. The only noticeable shift was the way she ingratiated herself with her group of friends, subtly turning them against me with increasingly pointed remarks at my expense. Then came the awards evening. That's when everything clicked. As I scanned the room, taking in her colleagues, I searched for any underlying tension, any sign of what had been lurking beneath the surface. Work was the logical place to investigate. She left for the office at 8 in the morning and returned home around 6 in the evening. There were no sudden business trips, no spontaneous girls' nights out, except for her birthday, when she and a few friends would enjoy a dinner show before spending the night in a shared hotel room. I had checked everything, her social media, the timestamps on photos stored in her phone. If she was meeting someone, it would have to happen quickly, within minutes. Not impossible, but highly unlikely. That left one option. If she was seeing someone, it had to be at work. Maybe it was because I had already convinced myself of her betrayal, or maybe it was the absurd, outdated mustache that made him stand out. Whatever the reason, the moment I saw him, I knew. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting people with casual backslaps, cracking jokes, effortlessly commanding attention. He worked the room like he owned it. When he finally reached our table, he greeted the others first before turning to Emma. Their eyes met, and in that fleeting second, they shared a look, a small, knowing smile. Then, his gaze shifted to me. His expression changed, just slightly, but unmistakably, into something smug. Without a word, he raised his right hand, reached across to his left shoulder, and with 2 fingers, brushed at something. Twice. It was subtle, barely a gesture, but it told me everything I needed to know. That tiny movement carried a message loud and clear: you don't matter. You're insignificant. Something I can flick away whenever I choose. I stood, leaned in, and drove my fist straight into the left side of his face. I'm not a fighter. Never have been. My arms aren't built for throwing knockout punches. But this one landed. Hard. He crumpled. And that was all it took for the entire room to explode into chaos. Gasps. Scrambling bodies. Excited whispers rippling through the crowd. Something unexpected had happened in their carefully structured world, and they relished every second of it, because it wasn't their mess to deal with. Emma had believed she had gotten away with it. She thought she was safe, that her secret would remain intact. But in that single instant, everything shattered. And worse, it happened at the absolute worst moment, in the absolute worst place. Her company's management team was primarily female, in keeping with modern industry trends. But regardless of their professional success, there were still 2 things they were expected to provide to the men in their lives: loyalty and exclusivity. And now, one of their own had been exposed. A new fear crept into the minds of every woman in that room. If Emma could be caught, if her deception could be laid bare so publicly, what was stopping their partners from scrutinizing them with the same level of suspicion? Emma wasn't just in trouble. She had just become the most unpopular woman in the room. I leveled my gaze at her, my voice steady and firm. For a long time now, you've been spinning stories for your little group of friends, painting me as some villain, telling them all about my so-called bad habits, making them believe your life with me has been nothing short of miserable. That's how I knew. The sheer amount of disrespect, the sheer audacity, it's actually incredible. Honestly, the level of creativity in those lies makes me think you should have been a fantasy writer. Her lips quivered. She hesitated, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, she whispered. So, you were planning to leave me. The realization settled in, bitter and final. My life had already felt like it was crumbling, and now I understood. This was the only conclusion left. I wasn't sure, she admitted softly. Her eyes glistened with fresh tears, but she wasn't one to back down. She held my gaze, refusing to look away. I was afraid. I frowned. Afraid? Of me? You actually thought I would hurt you. She shook her head so quickly it seemed almost painful. A single tear slipped onto the back of my hand. It stung like a frozen betrayal. I had to resist the urge to brush it away. No, I never thought that, she whispered. You would never hurt me. I was afraid of being alone. A bitter chuckle escaped my lips. So you did the one thing that guaranteed it. I shook my head. That makes no sense. She clutched a crumpled tissue, dabbing at her eyes. And besides, I added, you weren't alone, were you? You had Mr. 70's mustache keeping you company. You were making sure you had a smooth transition from me to him. She winced. No, it wasn't like that, wasn't it? She hesitated before speaking again, her voice barely above a whisper. I knew he wasn't the right choice after the first time. It had taken her an agonizingly long time to go through with that first betrayal, but once it happened, there was no turning back. She let out a heavy sigh, her shoulders sinking under the weight of her own choices. The damage was already done. She had crossed a boundary she once swore she never would. She had become the very thing she despised, a cheater. The word itself seemed to catch in her throat. And after that first time? Well, it didn't seem to matter anymore. She kept doing it, even with someone she wasn't particularly fond of. I gazed at her, an emptiness settling in my chest. I just wanted out, she admitted. I was exhausted by the marriage. Tired of having to consider 3 people before making any decision. I felt like I had lost the ability to be spontaneous. I exhaled slowly. Well, you certainly found spontaneity when it came to ending our marriage. A short, bitter laugh escaped her lips. Yay for me. I shook my head. You know, there was another way. You could have just come to me and said, Larry, you're a lousy husband, and I don't want to be with you anymore. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and in 6 months, I'll be free to be with Mustache Man whenever I please. You could have been honest. Her eyes shut tightly. I told you, I was scared. Afraid of being alone, I repeated. She nodded, her expression pained. Well done, Emma, I said flatly. You didn't want to be with me, and you didn't want to be with him either. Now you've set yourself up for immersion therapy. Congratulations. You get to live with the very thing you feared most. She remained silent. Oh, and it's going to be expensive, I continued. But hey, maybe it's worth it, right? You do make more money than me, and we both know I'll take better care of Brenda than you ever could. So there's spousal support and child support. Not cheap, but at least you got what you wanted. She pressed her lips together and gave a small nod. And just like that, our marriage was over. My mind screamed for more answers, more explanations. Who was he? Why did it happen? How often? And, for the love of all things holy, was he really so much better than me? But in the end, none of that truly mattered. What mattered was simple. She cheated. And that should come with consequences. I had one demand. You're going to go to our friends and tell them the truth. Everything you said about me, the lies, the stories, the insults, you're going to admit it was all just an excuse. That you made yourself the victim to justify what you did. Her breath trembled. Okay, I can do that. You lied about me, I said, my voice raw with anger. The level of disrespect is just beyond belief. Her face crumpled as she swallowed hard. I know. She hesitated, then added, I felt trapped in the mess I created, and I didn't know how to escape it. I nodded grimly. Yeah, I've heard it all before. For a brief moment, she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. I am sorry, Larry. You didn't deserve that. I didn't pull away, but I didn't hold on either. You were a good husband, she murmured. Just not the right one for me. I sighed. Everything was unraveling too fast, spinning out of my control. It felt like being in a car that was barreling toward disaster, only to realize that the steering wheel had come loose in my hands. I had no experience with this kind of situation. Who goes to a party married and leaves single, suddenly responsible for raising a 3-year-old alone? There aren't exactly guidebooks for that. You know they're going to talk about you for years, right? I said. She nodded. I know. There was a pause before she added, I probably deserve it. You were right. I should have divorced you first. Have you figured out where you're going to stay? I asked. She shrugged, motioning vaguely toward the still lively party inside. I was going to start looking for a place soon, but... I followed her gaze. She was about to face some very difficult conversations with upper management. Whether she'd still have a job after this was uncertain. It all depended on how important Mr. Mustache was to the company. I let out a slow breath. Jesus, Emma, how did we end up here? She didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I guess I became a manager. And I took that too seriously. I shook my head. You replaced everything you threw away, didn't you? She blinked at me, not understanding. Emma, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I love you. I stopped myself. Loved you. I exhaled, feeling the finality of it all. But I don't want to be part of your life anymore. I pushed my chair back and stood. I'm going outside. See if the cops show up. If they do, and they take me in. I met her eyes. Bail me out. You owe me that much. She nodded. Okay, Larry. And she did. That was the last time I saw her. By the time we crossed paths again, the divorce was finalized. She was no longer my wife. She was someone else's concern. Once, I had loved that woman. I had vowed to spend my life with her. I had dreamed of growing old by her side. And she had stopped loving me. So she cheated. She didn't even have the courage to face me until the very end. That's how I saw it. She committed the betrayal, and I was the one who paid for it. The heartbreak, the loneliness, the slow, grueling process of healing, the mistrust that would follow me into every future relationship. It wasn't going to be easy, not with a golden-haired, spirited 3-year-old who needed me. Emma had broken me, but I wasn't done yet. Here's the rephrased version of your text. As for her reputation, I would ensure it stayed with her, subtly, yet effectively. Her actions wouldn't be forgotten. Stay subscribed and always be a step ahead of those who deceive. And believe me, the next story will make this one seem like a mere fairy tale.